Alright, and we're live. My name is Kent C. Dodds, and I am in need of some help with Protractor. So I have asked two Protractor experts to answer some questions and give some good tips and tricks to using Protractor for end-to-end testing. So yeah, why don't you guys introduce yourselves and what you know about Protractor, and we can talk about it.
Okay.
Andres, you start.
Okay. My name is Sandra Dominguez. I'm a software engineer in Google, New York. I've been working in Protractor since the beginning. I was actually the first Protractor user inside of Google. I did the website, and I'm pretty sure, the largest Protractor user in the universe, according to Julie Ralph, the author of Protractor. What about you, Carmen?
Okay, so I'm Carmen. Yeah, I started with Protractor somewhere at the end of last year. Yeah, so inside of my company, we use it a lot, and we have we're required to have about 95% code coverage using end-to-end tests. So yeah, I started using it there, and then one of my assignments in my company was to sort of try to figure out like a style guide to help our teams write better Protractor code. So yeah, that's how my search in Protractor started.
That's great. That's exactly what I need, I think. So actually, something that you said, Carmen, sparked my interest. So I was under the impression you couldn't get code coverage reporting on end-to-end tests with Protractor. Is that not true? Can you get coverage reporting with Protractor?
Oh, I cannot hear you so well. Can you please repeat
sorry,
the question?
Put that on my lap.
Cool. That's better.
So,
Thanks.
You said that you're required to have a certain percentage of coverage, test coverage with Protractor. Can you get coverage reporting with Protractor?
Yeah, you can do that. I think we're currently using an NPM plugin. I think it's called Grunt Protractor Coverage or something like that. I can look it up really quickly. But it's like you can use it, and well, it's pretty much out of the box. If you just do the settings that you have in the manual, then you can set it up, and then it's quite easy to use.
Does it use Istanbul, or is it some other tool?
As far as I know, it uses Istanbul. Yeah.
Because I'm using ES6, and so I'd rather have coverage on my actual code rather than Babel's output of my code. But I recently discovered something called Sparta, which will allow me to do that. So I imagine I just have to figure out how to hook those together. Cool. I didn't realize that I could have coverage with Protractor. That's awesome.
Yeah, you can.
Cool. So why don't I kind of talk about what we are doing here and what our needs are, and then we can you guys can help me figure out what I need to do. And good tips and tricks are good. So we want to do continuous delivery and continuous integration, and so I've been on a quest to figure out what tools that we need to be able to do that with confidence. And so Protractor, obviously, for end-to-end testing is kind of the de facto for Angular applications, and so I created a couple little trial runs with some of my open source projects, and it was actually surprisingly easy to do. But I'm just kind of not certain of I don't want to build this huge big test suite and find out that I built it wrong, and now I have this big test suite to manage and maintain that is itself needs to be tested because it's so brittle. So nice, thanks, Carmen. That was good.
Sorry,
that was at the beginning of the chat.
That was my phone.
So anyway, what I really want is obviously right now we have no coverage at all from an end-to-end test perspective, at least from my stuff. Sorry, I should mention we do have automation engineers here who have written a couple of end-to-end tests, but it's totally different technology, and totally outside of what I'm doing. So yeah, I want to be able to set this up as part of the project, committed to the source, and using the best practices. So our app has like the only public-facing thing is a login screen, and then from there you can create accounts and you can create users, and it's just like this big CRUD app. There's actually not a lot outside of CRUD that would need to be tested. So yeah, so that's where I'm at. And one other thing, I have a preference to Mocha. All of our unit tests are in Mocha, and so if like I looked and there was sort of a way to use Mocha with Protractor, but I'm open and willing to use Jasmine if there's a reason to not use Mocha. So anyway, that's just kind of an overview. So what would you guys suggest for, I don't know, like a good way to structure my Protractor tests, just to kind of get started?
I can start. So I think it really depends, like which scaffolding strategy you're using. Like most of our apps, like most of our internal apps have, like they use the old scaffolding, which is one like with services and controllers. So not the one by feature. And so like all our end-to-end tests are in a separate folder, in a test folder. So all the unit and end-to-end tests are all in one place. I've been recently trying to work with the other scaffolding structure. At first I had all my components, and then all the unit tests and end-to-end tests, they were all in one place, like per component. But then we were discussing about this, and we actually don't fully agree with the idea that we have production code and test code in one place. So then in the end, we decided to move all our tests again in a separate folder that is like just a separate test folder, and we keep the same structure as in like our main, like in our root folder. So you have the components and the subpages and all that. But still, we really didn't want to have the test code be in the same place as the production code. So that would be one thing that I could say from our experience.
What was the reason for moving it like that? Like, because I'm a big proponent of putting tests next to the thing that it's testing. So what was the argument against that, I guess?
Yeah, so the argument for that was, well, because in our build process we are kind of manipulating the code of the project. So we really want to make sure that we don't ship any tests in production. So we really want to make sure that only the files that need to be bundled will be bundled, and we don't do like add tests by accident. Like, okay, yeah, we really want to be sure. I mean, there are not so high chances of that happening, but then we really wanted to be sure. So yeah, that was our reasoning.
Okay, and you mentioned that you have like your component end-to-end tests, or so like insinuating there's an existence of a component end-to-end test. But I was always kind of under the impression that you don't, like, you unit test your components and then you like integration test everything when it's all put together. So how do you or is it advisable to have a component end-to-end test that like goes to a specific page and that this component exists on, and test that, like maybe, for example, a type ahead or autocomplete thing? Like for that test, do you go to a page that's being used on, or do you have a special page that's only for testing purposes to test that component?
Yeah, maybe also Andres wants to add to this one. So usually how we do it is So it depends. So we have two kinds of application. We have an application with an index page, for instance, and then with partials as well. So then, if that is the case, we most of the times test against the partial that comes with the application. But if you have something like, for instance, a component that needs to be tested in sort of isolation, so there's no real partial for it, like for instance a directive, of course, I mean, it can have like a template attached to it. But if there's no page where that component is integrated, then what we usually do is we create a test page for it, we integrate it, and then that also makes much more sense for using page objects, because then you have this test page, and then when you write your page object, you clearly know what's happening on that page, so it's much more easier to create the interface for that page. But maybe Andres has something else to say.
Okay, so when you're starting a big Protractor project, you have to be aware that there's going to be a cost. So you're going to spend time and effort in your project, and it's going to be running. And once you have it, it's like having a parallel production service that's going to be running all the time. So the more specific you make your tests, it's going to become flaky over the long run, and then you're going to hate Protractor because you change like this text here and it's going to break something else. So you have to be aware of like what is it that you want from Protractor. Do you want to have like the confidence that your binary is like fit to go to production? And if so, maybe it makes sense to make it, okay, I'm going to be running this. This is going to tell me, okay, you can go from development to QA to staging to production, or however, like, I don't know how many environments do you have. I only have like 3, 4 that I testing. And you also need a strategy, because if you're not able to build your entire application from like a point in your repository, let's say you have this version, this tag, and then I'm going to be building this thing, it's going to be a little bit hard to have a like Protractor doing everything. Okay, let me explain myself. So when you run Protractor, it's going to change the state of the world. So you have like a persistence layer. You have a database, and maybe you have transactions, and you have other systems that are going to integrate into your main application. And every time you do stuff, it's going to change the database. So it's probably going to be like, okay, do I need to create an entirely new database from scratch? Is it going to happen for my development environment? Is it going to happen for QA? Or do I have data in QA already? And once you have like this like idea of where is it that you're going to be running it, you're going to run into this other problem, which is I call the babushka phenomenon. So when you're testing something, there's always like a container. So the babushka is like this, I don't know if it's Russian or maybe from Eastern Europe, like this doll that you open it and there's another doll and another doll. So usually when you have an application, you have a container. So imagine that you have like a restaurant application. So for your restaurant application, imagine that you have a bill and you have dishes. And before you can imagine that you're having like a test to make sure that you can create a bill for a customer and it contains dishes. So your system needs to have dishes before you have a bill. So are you going to be creating the dishes before you create your bill for the customer, or you have them already? And in my project, for example, it's called a project. So you create a project, you have a user, you give permissions to the user, and then you start creating stuff. So I work in Google Cloud Storage, and we have buckets. Buckets are like containers for objects. So imagine that you want to test that you can upload an object into a bucket. You need a project, you need a user who has permissions, you need to create a bucket, and then you need to upload this file. So are you going to be creating this through Protractor, or is your database going to have this already? Are you going to start with an empty database? Are you going to insert all of these elements into your persistence layer? Or are you going to be doing it by making like API calls? So depending on that, you need like a different strategy. And also, I like to have my Protractor tests. They should be able to run everywhere. So you should be able to run from scratch, from your development environment, even production. And then when you're hitting production, obviously you're going to be doing stuff, and that may be expensive. So I work in Google Cloud, and if you want to create something, it's going to use computing resources. So if you create a cloud instance, imagine compute engine, or you have a cloud SQL, or you have buckets and stuff like that, that's going to cost. So you need to clean up after you create all of this stuff. So are you going to have like a batch process that's going to be cleaning after? So it can get very, very complex. So if you don't have all of these problems in mind before you start, you're going to end up with like some project that you started but you really didn't know in which kind of problem you were getting into.
So you would say, like, right from the get-go, I should...
you need a strategy.
Yeah, okay. I think maybe what I'll probably do, because like, I think it's more valuable to start getting early wins to convince the business that it's worth spending time on it. And so I'll probably just kind of do higher level things, maybe create a user, then delete the user, just so that I don't have to say, hey, I need to write a batch process or a bunch of SQL statements or something to like. Anyway, I think the faster I can get something done and like starting to provide us value, the better. And then if I could convince them like, hey, so like this Protractor thing has been really cool. We'd like to add some more tests, and so it's going to take a little bit more time. And at that point, they'll understand like why that's a valuable thing.
Okay, and that takes me to the next layer. It's like, okay, so when you're testing Protractor, you can have something very simple. So you're testing one babushka. So you say, I'm creating a user, and updating the user, changing the password or something like that, and then I delete it. So that's a regular CRUD on your application. But you always need a user to log in, right? So it's probably a good idea to have that user already. And of course, you can have a test to make sure that you can create a user, because it's very important to have a user and being able to log in. But you should also have test users there. Then you can test a feature. So you're testing the user creation or user management. But you also need, you have like these views that allow you to perform like a user action. So the user goes to your application because they want to accomplish something. So you should test that flow. Like, okay, I'm going to create my user. I'm going to go into this application. So for example, Carmen works in finance. So you have, imagine that I want to pay my credit card. So I need a user, I need a credit card, and I need some expenses on my credit card. Therefore, I can go pay my credit card and make sure I paid it. So imagine that you have this flow. It's going to go through several views. And that's going to be a little bit more complex than your regular, okay, I can create a user, update a user. Then that's a second level, whenever you're hitting more than one view. And the third level is something that I call ping pong. What happens when you have different users that interact with the same data? So you may have part of the flow happens on one user, then you log out, you log in with a different user, a second user changes something on this data, and then you log in with the first user again, and then you make sure that those changes are reflected for the first user. It depends on your application, but sometimes different users have different views on the same data, so you want to make sure that everything works when one user changes the persistence layer, and then the second user can see it and do something about it.
Cool, that makes sense. So I remember in our talk on Angular Error a couple weeks ago, you mentioned a tip about page objects. I think that's what you called it. Can you describe what that is a little bit? I looked into it a little bit, but I think maybe if you can describe what a good page object is, like what methods it has, and that kind of thing.
Carmen is an expert on page objects.
Oh God, I'm not the expert, but I can explain. So, like the first time when I heard about page objects, I really thought it was a protractor thing. But then somehow I was curious what it meant, so I was Googling about it, and then it actually turned out that page objects is not at all a protractor thing, but more rather like an end-to-end testing strategy. So the way I think of page objects is like an API to your user interface. So for instance, if you have a view, your page object is basically an API, and that API is going to contain everything that the user can do with that page. So in it should contain all interactions that the user can do. So if, for instance, if the user can click on an element, then the API should be able to do that. And or yeah, if you can fill in an input, then the API should be able to do that for you. And the benefit of using page objects is that it really separates concerns. So it really separates your test code from your view implementation details. So that means that if your view changes, you will not have to change. That change will not reflect in your test. That change will reflect in the internals of the API, but the API to the user to the consumer of the API will still be the same. So, for instance, if you have an input with a certain ID, and like in the life cycle of the application, that ID changes, all you need to do is you need to change that ID inside of your page object. So you will probably, inside of your page object, you will have you'll use a locator strategy to select that element, and then all you have to do is just in that one place, you just need to change that ID, and the tests will just still run, basically. So you don't need to change anything in your tests, just in your page object. And to the consumer, yeah, as I said, the API remains the same. So in this way, your test code is completely unaware of how you've built your view, basically. It just needs to know that API, and that's it. That's all it's concerned with. And the page object should just keep track of how the view is implemented.
Cool. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You described the benefits really well. That's kind of an obvious.
There's also something like if you do a little bit extra on top of page objects, you can have wrappers for your directives. Some of your directives are going to be very complex. Everybody has a grid, right? So you have a table with columns, and probably you want to access some values on that table. And that table may be very, very complex. So you really don't want to keep writing in all of your page objects. Whenever you have a table, you don't want to rewrite it over and over and over again. So it probably makes sense to have a directive wrapper, which is like a mini page object that allows you to interact with this directive. And you can also use bench press. So bench press uses Protractor, and you make sure that the performance of your directive is good whenever you're working on it. So you have like a demo page. It's not your real application, but it's somewhere where your directive lives and where you can test it. So what bench press does is like it goes over and over and over and over again to the same view, and it interacts with the directive, and it makes sure that whenever you make some change, especially in a table, in a grid where you have like tons of watches, you're not hurting the performance of your application. So we do something like that, and it proved to be like very convenient, because sometimes you change something and that directive is being used in half of your views. So if you break something in your directive, that's going to break half of your tests. So if you test this individually, you make sure that it's good.
Yeah, I looked at bench press a little bit, and it just looked like super complex. But I think that if I got used to Protractor, it'd probably be a little easier.
There's a really good presentation that we had last month by Leonardo Sitzamia. I haven't uploaded the video, but he was here in the Angular New York meetup. I will upload it and I'll share the link.
Great. Yeah, that sounds good. Because we do in fact have a table, not a grid, but it's like a table of items, and then you can click an edit button, and it pops down, edit for that item, and like that is way slow. And so looking to optimize that, and I was looking at bench press to figure out how to optimize that. Still, haven't found a solution. So on mobile, it's embarrassing. But that's whatever you have time for. So let's see. I feel like there was another question that I had. So yeah, I think that was. Oh yeah. So backend requests. Do you recommend? Because I remember on our show, I think it was either you, maybe it was Julie, who mentioned HTTP proxy to proxy your backend. Is this recommended, or I guess it kind of depends on what you want to do, but would you recommend mocking your entire backend or hitting the actual backend?
I prefer not to mock. But if you're dealing with money, probably it makes sense to mock. So depends on how difficult it is to create that state in your persistence layer, and if clicking on something is going to cost you money, or if it's going to get you in trouble. So I don't know. So I have some of my tests for my previous project, they run in production. And that's fine for that particular project, but I don't know if it would make sense for my current project to run in production all of the tests. So we have some kind of mocking depending on the environment where you're running.
Okay, yeah, that's sensible.
Yeah, we do the same. We also mock stuff. So I'm not aware of reaching the backend in any of our end-to-end tests, as far as I know. So we also mock everything. But I would actually have to double check that. But for the projects that I've seen, they all use mocks.
Okay, and you'd recommend HTTP proxy, or is there another good backend proxy for Protractor that I should look at?
I actually don't know. I would have to look it up for this. I don't know, Andres, what you use, but I would have to check for that. I'm not sure at the moment.
I've seen on Stack Overflow there's one, I forgot the name, but it's heavily used. You can also use Protractor has this feature called mock modules, so you can mock some of your modules. If you're able to extract the stuff that is going to cause you trouble or going to cost you money into services, and then, okay, you have this module, this set of services in this module, you can just mock it and replace it for your tests and make them behave in a certain way. And that's more philosophical. If you ask me, I would say I used to be a banker, so if you make a mistake, it's going to be very expensive. And once one of our systems went down half an hour before the market closed, and we couldn't move like half a billion dollars. So imagine, it was a big problem. So I'm very careful when I try to test something. I want to make sure that you're hitting the real deal, because when you start mocking, you're lying to yourself. And if you want to have confidence that your application works, you can say, yeah, whatever, whenever I request something, it's going to give me something. And then since it's web development, in web development, everything is a string. So you're just playing with strings that are not real. Those strings are never going to fail. There's never going to be like a transaction failing. There's never going to be like an interaction with another system failing. The other system is never going to fail. So you will never know, and you will blindly go to production, and they will call you in the middle of the night. And it's something you could have prevented if you had a good strategy to test on the real deal.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. So don't mock it. I think we could probably avoid mocking for most of our stuff. I don't think there are a couple of things that cost us money, but we can deal with this. So cool. Are there any other tips or tricks with using Protractor that we haven't talked about? I think I had all my questions answered.
Okay, so I have a lot of tips. So the first tip I would give to people who are starting with Protractor is check what tools are available out there. I created a tool called Elementor that allows you to interact with your browser. So you launch Elementor, and then in the browser itself, you can interact with your Angular application, and it will give you suggestions about like what kind of locators you can use to access those elements in the view, and it will do it against a live Protractor session. I've seen on Stack Overflow a lot of questions about like how do I use this, or people confuse the Protractor API with jQuery, and it has nothing to do with jQuery. In some instances, it looks like jQuery, but it's not. It's just WebDriver.js with some sugar on top of it.
Yeah, I would also, like in the spirit of what Andres said, I would also recommend checking out WebDriver.js. For me personally, it helped me a lot. Because, for instance, if you look at the documentation for Protractor, you can get a bit confused because some of the APIs belong to Protractor, but also some of the APIs come from WebDriver.js. Now that I know that I looked into it, for me the difference is quite clear, but maybe in the beginning it can be a bit confusing. For me, it really helped looking a bit into WebDriver.js and understanding what's going on there. So I would also definitely recommend that.
Promises. What about promises and the control flow?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's just promises. Like everything is a promise. So yeah, keep that in mind. And
so,
yeah,
that's something that confuses a lot of people. So everything that you ask from Protractor, it will be resolved as a promise. So imagine that you have something like this. Okay, you go to a view and an input has this value. So you read it, then you click on something or you change the value, and then you say, okay, make sure that it changed. That's not going to work if you have a reference to the element at the beginning and then you check it at the end, because Protractor, first, it will resolve everything with a promise, and second, it will not give you the value of something unless you call a function on one of the Protractor objects. So there are a couple of objects you have to know. There's browser, which is basically a WebDriver with some extensions in the prototype from Protractor. There's element, and then there's element.all. Element, you use it to find one element, and element.all, you use it to find multiple elements. For the API, we're going to spend 3 days fixing it the first week of July. So if you have any comments or suggestions, please file a bug on the Protractor GitHub page, and we should fix it during that week. And we're going to be working on that part, which is very, very confusing because you don't know what's Protractor and what's WebDriver.
So are we going to have breaking changes with 3 days, or is this just enhancements to add to the API?
It's going to be basically improving the current documentation, and there's an API search page. I don't know if you have seen it. contains like many, many, many functions, and it's searchable. And we can do a better job at showing you what comes from WebDriver and what comes from Protractor. And we want to provide an example for each one of the functions to make it clear.
Yeah, that sounds really useful. Cool. I think that was it. You guys have been really helpful at giving me a good idea of what direction that I should take our Protractor tests. I'm really looking forward to shipping daily, many times a day, and I don't think that'll happen without Protractor. So, yeah, it's awesome.
Yay!
Cool. Anything else before I go over to stand up?
About Elementor, because sometimes, so I use it, and actually it kind of saved my ass a couple of times because I was using some locator strategies and I was really fighting with them. So when you're not sure what to use, which selector, play with Elementor, and Elementor will give you some tips as to what you can use to select a certain element. So I would definitely recommend that, especially in the beginning when you're starting with it. It's really cool to have these things and just see what's possible and what's not possible, and then you can also test yourself, things like that. It can be very handy because sometimes you can just overlook like the obvious things. So I many times use it as a double check tool. So yeah.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you guys you taking time out of your morning or evening or afternoon to chat with me about this. And I'll keep you updated on my progress. And yeah, so thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome.
Oh, Carmen, you have a GitHub repo with best practices and stuff. Do you want to put that in the Hangout comments so people can?
Yeah, sure, for sure. It still needs love, but it's a start.
Awesome.
Yeah, sure, I will do. Cool.
Well, see you later.
Ciao. Ciao, ciao.
Bye.